Hello, and welcome to another episode of Reading Reddit with Amber. Happy Spooky Sunday! Today we're hopping on over to r/LetsNotMeet to find some creepy stories. I use creepy music in the background for these videos. Because the sound intensity level varies depending on whether you're listening with headphones or without, I have developed both a version that is best with headphones and a version that is best without. You are listening to the headphones version. For the no headphones version, click on the link in the description below. Our story today is Crazy Ron. Over the years, as a woman who has declined every proposal of marriage or conventional living arrangement, largely moving through life as a single female, I've gathered more tales of dangerous chance encounters than I can even rattle off in a day. Stalkings, a murderer that has never been apprehended, death threats, actual physical assaults. And I'm not especially defiant of common sense or rules to live by, i.e., don't walk alone after dark. I never open the door to strangers. I'm not chatty or inclined to give people I meet my phone number, even if they seem stable. Really, I'm just socially lazy. But my earliest memory of contact with a predator predates the invention of the internet, when I was just a child, living with my also very single mother. We had just moved into a large, white, American colonial-style home across the street from a daycare center. It was the nicest home we had lived in thus far, which says a lot because my mother was forever struggling to keep me clothed and fed, while my father pursued his dreams of being an artist and could afford to pay little in child support. But he did pay, without fail every month, and ultimately became a very successful painter and left me an impressive legacy. I'm very proud to be his daughter. I was excited because I had the entire downstairs level to serve as my own personal play palace, away from my chronically high-strung mother, and she was relieved to be directly across the street from reliable childcare. Perhaps the low rent had something to do with the fact that our neighbors to the right were Moonies, essentially members of a worldwide cult referred to as the Unification Movement. A group of them lived in an upscale home a stone's throw away with shuttered windows that never opened, and we almost never laid eyes on them. Never during the daytime. Never, ever. To our left was Ron. Ron was a middle-aged man, probably in his 40s, a little more than a decade older than my mother. I was 7 at the time and pretty observant and stoic for a child, so it didn't escape my notice that Ron was eccentric, peculiar, always wound up and kind of dopey at the same time. He had wild dark hair that stuck up and kind of fanned out on the sides but was thinning on top, where he insisted on conspicuously combing in such a manner as to hide his visible scalp. He wore wire-rimmed glasses that magnified his eyes and somehow lent him an air of goofy harmlessness, like the fourth missing stooge. When we first met Ron, who appeared in our front yard one day after my mom collected me from daycare, my mother's weirdo meter went off. He seemed overeager to be living next to a financially strapped single mother and her strange daughter. My mother was beautiful by any standards, however, tall, willowy, with long, dark blonde hair that ended at her waist, and perpetually the perfect shade of tan, thanks to her very Native American grandparents that raised her for most of her formative years. Really a striking and unusually beautiful woman. But troubled. She was troubled for a lot of cultural reasons, which left her socially awkward and gun-shy, and also sympathetic to other socially challenged individuals, so she gave Ron the benefit of the doubt. I thought, and she would later say that she thought as well, that Ron just developed a very big crush, fast and understandably. It started with a locket which had a picture of me inside it. That was the first gift he surprised her with, calling up to the house, standing outside our fence. It looked like an antique to us, which Ron confirmed he came across at work, as he was an antiques dealer. My mother was deeply disturbed by the photo of me, which was obviously taken unbeknownst to anyone while I was playing in the backyard, and back then everything was done with 35mm film. No one had cell phones or home printers, even disposable cameras. We had Polaroid and 35mm, and this was 35mm, meaning there were likely other photos of me which had been developed sitting in his house. My mother tried to refuse the gift, also explaining that she was not by any means okay with anyone taking photos of her daughter without her consent, but then Ron appeared to be inconsolably apologetic, so she accepted, reluctantly thanked him, and we both returned inside. The next gift was a large stereo system. Stereo systems were not cheap in those days, and this was one of the more expensive models. Ron, who always looked especially sweaty and sickly in the Texas heat, said he had received it from a pawn shop owner he was friendly with, but had a home stereo as well as a system at the antique shop, so he couldn't benefit from it, didn't want to go to the trouble of selling it, and wouldn't want it to go to waste when it could go to us, since he was certain we did not have a system of our own. He was right. We had a little boombox. Well, I had one. My mother had books and her writing, and eschewed other forms of entertainment as brain-rotting. My mother refused the extravagant gift, but Ron begged her to take it for my sake, and finally she relented, incredibly uncomfortable. She said at least she could listen to Tina Turner, of whom she was quite the fan. However, she took Ron's suggestion and set up the system in my den downstairs. The third gift was a camera, an obviously expensive professional camera, which he again claimed he had received from a friend of his who was also in some sort of retail business. These items didn't look used in any way, and my mother really wanted the attention to stop at this point. She flatly refused the gift and drew her line in the sand. No more gifts. None. Period. She began to dread coming home from work, and I was no longer allowed to play in the yard. Despite the absence of gifts, Ron would still appear at the fence or catch my attention from the bottom window, and I would instinctively go get my mother, who would come down and firmly, but politely, tell him it was not a good time for visiting or neighborly chit-chat. My mother and father had just worked out a new visitation schedule, and I was to be spending Saturday nights at his house. Up to that point, I spent Friday nights there, but it was all 6 of one, half a dozen of the other as far as she was concerned, so Saturday it was. That first Saturday went smoothly, until the following Sunday morning when my father returned me to my mother's house and we learned someone had broken into the home, taken nothing, and gone nowhere except downstairs. My mother had heard them come in and quietly lock the door at the top of the stairs, which was a weird feature we were suddenly grateful for, and proceeded to hide from the intruder until he left some minutes later. I had just fortunately been away at the time, because it was quite typical of me to be up late on a Saturday night, listening to the stereo, since there was no school or work the next day for either of us. The police told her she needed a dog of any size and a gun. She took off work the next day and I stayed another night with my father while she went shopping for a shotgun. At some point, while talking to my father about the incident, the matter of neighbors came up and Ron entered the conversation. When my father learned about all the attention Ron had fixed on my mother, he was naturally alarmed, especially for me, whom he worried might get caught in the crosshairs. My dad was kind of a vaguely, emotionally unavailable man, but not an absentee father by any means. And I knew, beneath his somewhat distant, placid surface, he loved me greatly. My mother would later tell me about his duality, unable to pass up taking in a stray dog or cat, but he would come home from the bars covered in other people's blood. He had been a boxer for many years in the service, and he was unafraid of even people he probably should have avoided. Something of a wild card. You never knew what he would do when push came to shove. Some time went by, not a great deal, a week or two, and I began to notice Ron walking by my school often when we were at lunch recess. He'd stop and say hi, which no one seemed to notice. I didn't mention it to my parents, because I really didn't understand the true concept of child predators at that age, and because Ron never engaged me beyond saying hello or waving as he walked along the fence. It never occurred to me that anything untoward was happening. Finally, one day, he stopped at the fence and said, "I'm going to get some ice cream. It's so hot out." "Aren't you hot?" It was frickin' Houston, Texas. Even as a child, born and raised, I remember sweating in my shoes and speculating about the blistering temperature with my friends on the playground some days. Is it 120 degrees? 200 degrees? We didn't know, but we thought it was close and had overheard news reports of elderly people expiring from heat stroke. My father always spoke of melting into a puddle on the sidewalk, and it conjured images of grandmothers liquefying like candles into unidentifiable pools of wax on the concrete. So heck yes, I was freaking hot. I nodded. "I really wish I could take you to get some ice cream with me," he said, sticking his fingers through the high chain link fence. "Hey," he exclaimed as though he was suddenly brained with a brilliant idea. "You want to go get some ice cream with me?" That was a defining moment in my child's brain, when it became something other than simply the mind of a child. I understood then that Ron was not just crazy Ron, as my parents had called him. He was sinister. His intentions were dark, darker than I could fathom. But I seemed to snap to that awareness too. Up to that point, we had been warned what adults who sought to hurt children would say to lure us away from safety. It was all over television commercials, billboards, pamphlets, Police and guest speakers visiting our school would recite the script of lines meant to tempt us with promises of pixie sticks and bubble gum. But they never told us what happened after that. What they would actually do after dropping the bait. And I didn't need to know. An uneasy feeling crept over me and I backed away from the fence, saying I needed to go. Recess was almost over. About an hour later, I was called into the principal's office. I was terrified and had never been called down to the office before, still a pretty well-behaved kid at this stage in my life. Once I walked in, I saw both my parents and my stomach dropped. My mother was visibly shaken and my father was pacing. I had only seen my father angry one time that I could recall, yet I knew in my gut that he was seething with anger in that moment. I knew I was really screwed if my mother and father had to leave their respective jobs to come deal with something I had done. For the life of me, I couldn't figure out what it had been though. I quickly learned that Ron had gone into the office, saying that he was my father. He was picking me up and we would be moving promptly to another state, so I wouldn't be returning. Luckily, my father was a very involved parent and he was also friends with the artist's boyfriend of my teacher at the time. We often ran into them at the art supply store and Miss Curie knew extremely well what my father looked like. When she received word that my father was there to whisk me away for good, she went straight to the office to learn more. The man standing before her was clearly not my father, and the staff's internal alarms were rung. The police had already taken Ron, and I'm not really sure what happened next, but I do know that at some point in the days that followed, Ron returned home briefly. Long enough for my father to find him. Unfortunately, my father is no longer living and he can't fill in the blanks at this part of the story, but I do remember he came straight to the house looking flustered, holding one hand in another and wincing. He did tell us that Ron wouldn't be living next door any longer, and if he ever saw a trace of him again, my father would kill him with his bare hands. He then took me to his house for several days, and when I returned home, Ron was gone and the police continued to move in and out of his house for the rest of the week. There were no stalking laws at the time in Texas, and even kidnapping was a fairly new concept to the law enforcement with limited protocols in place. It was the 80s. But what I have been able to piece together is that eventually the police were able to tie Ron to the break-in at my mother's house, where he had likely gone, clumsily planning to abduct me, and whatever they found in his house was enough to keep him behind bars. We learned that Ron had been living with his mother, Norman Bates style, his entire life until she died not long before, leaving him the house next to us in the antique shop. He was not a well-balanced, functional adult, and was likely psychosexually stunted for reasons I can never really know. The part that really makes me uneasy here is Ron's plan to move with me in tow. I couldn't imagine he was actually planning to abandon the home he owned. I don't know if he was simply being compulsive, thinking he would work out the kinks after he got me in his clutches, or if he already had some terrible plan to dispose of me and the evidence before I was officially declared missing. My mother purchased a German Shepherd, violating the terms of her lease, and we had to move to a garage apartment across town, so we never saw Ron again. Hopefully no one did outside of fellow prisoners, but I suspect he was eventually released back into society again at some point. But who knows? I doubt he's even alive in 2020. I suppose the most frightening aspect of this whole ordeal is not that he existed in the first place, but that my mother was never the target, only an obstacle. And all the flattery and attempts to infiltrate her life were simply the acts of a man trying to get around her to her child. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, consider giving it a like or letting me know in the comments. Thanks for watching and have a great day.